Hey everyone, today I'm back in Final Fantasy XIV. It's been a little while, but we finally managed to clear our latest raid tier. I'll talk about the reasoning a little bit more later, like we had some scheduling issues, we've been raiding with some substitutes as well, but I'll kind of give you guys the full story towards the end of the video. But as per usual, I first want to talk about the fights themselves, kind of give my first impressions, talk about our prog, that kind of stuff, just like I do whenever we do clear a new raid tier. So, starting with P9 Savage. This is actually a pretty solid first encounter, I would say. When it comes down to the mechanics themselves, they weren't too difficult to learn, except 11 Strike maybe, the very first limit cut. That was kind of like the big wall for most groups. But the rest of the mechanics are fairly straightforward to figure out, and they're also pretty fun to execute on. The elemental mechanics themselves, I think, are pretty fun. Like, they're very basic, I guess you could say, because like the most basic / fundamental mechanic in Final Fantasy is stack and spread with in and out. It's like something that's in pretty much every fight at this point. But the extra layer of the elemental thing attached to it I thought was pretty clever. Because basically when I was learning it at the beginning, I wasn't really sure why we were going to the places that we were. But then when you learn, well, if you did normal mode, you pretty much know this, but I just went through normal mode and then kind of forgot about the fight. You know that whenever he shows an element on the screen, that is the element that will be expanding. So when you know what the mechanic itself is going to be, like for example, ice is a donut, or like an inside safe mechanic, I guess you could say, fire are the individual AoEs, and then lightning are the line AoEs. If you know what they look like, just think that they expand, basically, and that would then be your new save spot. So I thought it was kind of clever. Like, sure, it's very simple and straightforward. You just go to your position and then you either move in or out, depending on the element that shows up. But it's a nice extra layer that I don't think we've really seen before, so it was pretty fun. Again, when it came down to 11 Strike, this was kind of a big wall for most groups as well as mine. Even for re-clears, we kind of meme on this pretty much every single week, at least once. But once it was figured out, it's honestly not a very difficult mechanic as long as you're able to keep track of what you personally are responsible for. Like, if you know your personal responsibility, the mechanic itself isn't super difficult, but you do need to keep track of all of what is happening, so you don't mess it up, because one person messing up could usually end up leading to a wipe, which I thought was kind of punishing for like a very first fight, but it's something that I also don't mind seeing how it is a Savage difficulty encounter. Outside of 11 Strike, I feel like the rest of the mechanics weren't too difficult. Like, once they are figured out, not that difficult to execute on. I did particularly enjoy the second half of the fight because it's combining the normal mechanics with the elemental mechanics on top, so kind of adding an extra layer there. But overall the fight was pretty solid. I think the thematic of it is also really cool. Like, you're fighting basically like a medium or like a puppet that gets possessed by different souls, which I thought was kind of cool from like a thematic perspective. So yeah, I think first fight was really solid, pretty cool, definitely a fan. When it comes down to P10, the second encounter, this is the one that I was probably looking forward to the most when I did normal mode, for the very simple reason that it has a unique arena. Most of the arenas in 14 are either circles or squares, and they don't really do anything special with it. This one has the two extra like rectangles on the side, I guess you could say, that you sometimes will interact with as well. Now, I do think that they maybe could have made us interact with them a little bit more, but when I think about it, they probably have enough mechanics that has us do something with these platforms. It's kind of funny how they're like the special jails for our tanks, because like whenever he does the tank buster where he literally heats the tanks to the platforms, he's like, I got some special jails for you, which is kind of funny, because when they're on the platform, you can't leave without getting a very nasty dot, which you definitely don't want to have. If you have it on your DPS players, they're probably dead, unless the healer is literally babysitting them. So that voice line kind of made sense. It's actually kind of funny. But the way how you interact with the platforms are kind of nice. Like, you have to make sure that you build a bridge with the spider webs so that your tanks can leave, or so that the rest of the group that's on the main platform can go to the side platforms for like follow-up mechanics or something like that. And like just the whole spider mechanics in general, like all of the webbing and such, I think is pretty cool. Like, it's not really something that we've seen that often. Like, a normal stack AoE now becomes a little bit more intricate because you have to make sure that there is enough distance between everyone in the stack, because otherwise the webs that form on you become too strong and then you can't break those players out and they'll just die after some time. So a stack AoE becomes a little bit more intricate. You also, whenever you're spreading around with the individual AoEs, you need to make sure that you don't latch onto poles that are on the arena as well, because if you latch yourself onto them, someone needs to come free you. So you need to be extra wary of that. And then towards the end of the fight as well, whenever he does like the headbutts and then tries to push you off the arena, you have to literally build a wall of webs at the back of the arena to make it so that you don't get pushed off of the map, which I thought was really cool. The fight itself was also a little bit more difficult than I feel like it should have been, maybe, or it was just more difficult than I was expecting, because it is still the second fight in the raid tier. Stuff hits really hard. Some of the mechanics took us a little while to figure out as well, maybe a little bit longer than it honestly should have taken us, if we would have just looked at the debuffs or something like that. But I think this is a really good fight. It's also a very fun fight, like with all of the mechanics, like having to free your tanks, building a bridge, building a wall. I just really like the thematic of this fight, and whoever designed it, I hope they let design some more fights in the future as well. This one would have probably been like my favorite fight this tier if it wasn't for the next one. P11 then is, as I just said, my favorite fight of the tier because it just ticks all of the boxes for me. It has fun mechanics, the thematic of the fight is really cool, like you get the fight Themis in the arena where it's basically like you have the 14 seats, really cool. The music is also my favorite from the entire raid tier, like the very first two fights have music, which was quite alright actually, like I kind of enjoyed it. And then the final boss music, at least for the door boss, is the same theme of P9 and 10, but without like the muddled voice on it. Like it's basically a remix of that. And then of course like the final boss has its own theme as well. But the P11 theme, definitely my favorite one. The fight thematic itself looks really cool. It's all about to do with light and dark, and depending on which of the element that he has, the mechanic changes a little bit. I do understand that some players might not have enjoyed this fight as much because of the mechanics repeating so many times, because it basically like shows you a couple of basic mechanics and they get repeated throughout the fight a lot, and they also get layered on top of each other quite often as well during some of the combo mechanics. However, I did really enjoy the fight. The mechanics themselves were pretty fun. The layering of the mechanics was also done really well. That it basically just becomes this one giant dance of multiple mechanics just going off back to back to back to back, or at the same time sometimes as well. That it was really satisfying to just run through it. And then we also have like a couple of unique mechanics that just happen as a one-off, and that is kind of that. So P11, probably, if I look at like the total package from like encounter design, mechanics, music, this is probably my favorite one of the raid tier. Going into P12, the door boss. This is basically the gift that kept on giving, because there are so many mechanics in there where we thought we kind of figured it out, or that looked pretty like straightforward when we first saw them, and then there were actually a lot of extra things that we were doing wrong or that we just didn't realize were happening at the time, and then it took us quite a long time to figure out some of these things. The first one would be the very first mechanic. Like we tried doing it legit a couple of times. In the end we just ended up tank and voling it and cheesing it because we just couldn't be asked learning it, which probably will just keep on doing it that way until we're done with farming Savage, because it just makes this thing so much easier and brain dead. The first real mechanic then, the one with the towers, we thought we could always just do DPS left, tank healer right. In the end what we should have done is DPS counterclockwise from north, tank healers clockwise from north, and that would have made that mechanic so much easier. And then when it came down to the first super chain, that is where we were just completely oblivious to the fact that there are debuffs at play. So when we first saw this mechanic, we thought we just had to do the mechanics that the shapes were giving us. So the first one is like in or out with stack or spread, or like pairs or spread. Then you find the donut where you dodge, and then you go to the final one where it's in or out then in, and that's the end of the mechanic. Little did we know that we got debuffs. So the first time that we got to our donut, the second dodge, we saw that there were laser beams onto us. So the first thing that we kind of like thought about is that this is going to be light party spreads, or stacks I guess you could say. Because usually whenever two AoEs are involved, like two laser beams, like the stacks, or just two normal individual stack markers, they go onto the healers. If they don't go onto the healers, then it's usually going to be role based, like tank and healers together, DPS together. In this case, none of that seemed to work, and then we tried doing something a bit like distance baited as well, like on the two closest players. But then we found out that we all have debuffs, and it's just based on the debuffs that you have who gets the laser beams. Now, this is also where things got a little bit more complicated, because you couldn't just do everybody with a light debuff go left and everybody with a dark debuff go right, because you need to be hit by the opposite color. So what we did is our light laser beam would go left and our red laser beam would go right. And that meant that our light players, who need to get hit by the red laser beam, needed to go right. So depending on if you had the laser beam or not, it kind of added like this extra layer of thinking into the mechanic to make sure that you were going to be on the correct position. We ended up switching this around because apparently PF does it the other way around. So because we've been playing with substitutes for the last couple of weeks, we decided to just make it so that we're doing the PF strat for that one, so that if we do end up PFing it at some point when the raid tier gets unlocked or something, then we have the correct strategy for it as well, so that we don't have to like relearn weeks of something that we've been doing the same way. Towards the end of the mechanic then, again, there's an extra layer outside of just going in then out or out then in, because you also need to dodge the towers that are happening there. So one role is going to be getting individual AoEs, the other role is going to be playing around with towers. And when it comes down to these towers, they're actually really punishing. If a tower is not taken correctly, meaning by a player of the opposite element of the tower, it is going to blow up. So you can never sack these towers either. So if you drop a tower and somebody without a debuff takes it, it just explodes. If you drop a tower, somebody with the wrong debuff takes it, it also explodes. Now what happens is, when the tower drops and it hits a player, it changes their element or their aspect, color, whatever you want to call it. So if you and your partner, the one that is dropping the tower and the one that is taking the tower, accidentally overlap your movement, then the tower dropping would change the element of the person that's supposed to take it, and then you're going to be wiping because now there's nobody to take the tower anymore. So it took us a little while to kind of figure out the movement that we wanted to do there. For the spreads it was simple enough, like everybody just had their spread position and that was it. But with the towers, you kind of had to pay attention who you were paired with so that you knew where you were going to drop it. Like for example, what we did in the DPS role, for me personally, if I am paired with a melee, I am going away from the boss to drop my tower, or be there when my melee player drops the tower. And when I'm paired with my machinist, I'm just going to be close to the boss so that if I drop my tower, I'm not hitting the ranged, and the other way around as well. Once we figured all of that out and we kind of got to a like an understanding of where everyone was going to be, I guess, this mechanic did become a lot easier, but it is still probably the hardest mechanic in this entire fight. Then we have the add phase, which also gave us a lot more trouble than it honestly should have, because we tried to do the mechanics correctly, or tried to do the mechanics the way they were intended to be done. So the way how this happens is, whenever the boss does a dash for like the limit cut, she will dash to the player that she is dashing towards and stop there. So basically, if you made it so that the player that was being dashed was in front of the partner that is in the stack as well, then your partner wouldn't take damage. The thing is though, that there is an insane drop-off of damage in the distance that she travels. So sometimes if she dashes like a little bit closer than you would want her to do, then the damage of the dash just goes up exponentially, and it's by a crazy amount as well. So when it came down to that, basically by making it so that we wanted to prevent extra damage on our stack partner, we were making it so that the dash distance would kept getting closer and closer, because we were doing this stupid positioning thing. And honestly, because there's already so much AoE healing going on at that point anyways, because you need to heal up both players in the stacks so they can survive the next one and such, it was honestly making it much riskier on us trying to like bait it correctly, so to speak, that the dash would honestly start killing us instead of like the stack damage. So if we would have just forsaken this whole thing from the beginning and just went with just be at the wall as much as possible so that you barely take damage from the dash and we'll just do an extra heal in between, then we would have gotten through this end phase a whole lot quicker. When it came down to the second half of the fight, it's just 2 more super change, but these actually did work the way that we thought it would. There is still a mechanic from the boss going on, but this time around the boss is doing actual mechanics herself rather than just giving you a debuff and you figured it out kind of with a laser beam, because, well, I guess technically the laser beam comes from the boss, but it wasn't as obscure, I guess you could say. Like, what the boss is doing is very clear in both of these mechanics, and you kind of just had to go from there. I guess one thing I kind of forgot to mention is the cleaves, like the wing cleaves. That's something that kind of caught us off guard as well, because the very first time that she does the wing cleaves, all the way at the beginning of the fight, she always does the same one, where she will flip on the second wing cleave. However, after the first super chain, she does this mechanic again, and it is actually random if she flips or not. Now, at first we kind of thought, okay, the first time she does it, she flips, the second time she doesn't flip, okay, we just have to learn that. But then we found out that it actually depends on where the wings are starting, that she's going to flip or not. So if she goes from bottom to top, she's going to flip on the second wing. If they go from top to bottom, she's not going to flip. So it was kind of like a gotcha mechanic. You have to see it once at least to know what is kind of happening there. Like, we looked at our different pulls to kind of see what was different between them, and then we figured it out that way, because there wasn't really like a tell, like a cast bar that had a different name. For example, like with the group stack, if it's Apo, then the group needs to be in, the tanks need to be out, and if it's Petty, I believe, like at the start of the cast, then it's group out, tanks in. Like, that's very simple to figure out because that is a different cast bar, but we didn't actually realize that like the boss starting its wing pattern, top or bottom, had an effect on the mechanic. But once we figured that out, again, something that you know to pay attention to. So that's then kind of the door boss. When it comes down to the final boss, then this is a very unique fight, I would say. Definitely not something that I was expecting to be in a Final Fantasy game, or at least not 14, because the mechanics themselves are quite different, I guess you could say. The very first mechanic is kind of like the UAV. This was kind of funny because we just came from the Omega Protocol, where the world first used a zoom hack to clear the fight, and now they're basically giving us legit zoom hacks during the fight, which kind of had like some comedy factor to it. The mechanic itself is kind of cool, I guess, the first time that you do it, but I also felt like the first 2 minutes of this boss were just so incredibly boring. The UAV mechanic, while it is really cool the first time that you see it, or maybe like the couple of times that you see it, if you're hitting Enrage on this boss, or you're getting close to like figuring out those final mechanics, having 2 minutes of the fight basically not existing felt really bad, because it eats into your instance timer. Now, of course, I do understand that they have to show you this mechanic once and kind of like how the mechanics inside the UAV work as well, because at the end of the fight you're getting a more difficult version of it, but I feel like it just kind of dragged on for too long. Again, as I mentioned, the first 2 minutes of this fight basically don't exist. Now, of course, there are mechanics going on, but I feel like this very first UAV mechanic, they could literally put it in a dungeon and it would be fine, because that's how easy these mechanics are. Of course, you need to show the mechanics a little bit so that you can make them harder later in the fight, but still I would have liked that even this first UAV would have been a little bit more difficult, because you're literally just sleeping for the first 2 minutes of the fight. Luckily enough, the rest of the fight is not that resident sleeper. So after this you get to see the shapes for the first time, you kind of learn what needs to happen there, and then the second time you see shapes, they add an extra layer to it, like they change the order of the mechanics, and they also flip the arena 180 degrees during the mechanic, so you have to like reposition yourself, which I thought was kind of cool. When it comes down to the fire mechanic, that's probably my favorite one in this fight, because it requires very tight movement, not per se positioning, but movement. And that is something that we don't really see all that often in Final Fantasy. The first one I can think of is Nisi, where you have to be aware of what the rest of your team is going to be doing, so that you don't accidentally touch players while they are doing their movements for the mechanics. Another one would be the third phase of the Omega Protocol Ultimate. Depending on the debuff that you have, you're doing a specific movement, and you need to make sure that you don't hit other players while everybody is moving. Over here, while you don't necessarily need to pay attention to other players that you're not running into them, you need to be very concise, decisive, and precise with your movement so that you don't move too much or do unnecessary movement during this mechanic, because every time you move, you get a debuff. If you get too many debuffs, you're gonna blow up. Not per se every time you move, but like every set distance that you move, you get a stack of that debuff. So it was really cool that you had to just stand still and then look where you're going and then straight away go there, and no detours, no nothing. It had to be very decisive. And that's something that we don't really see all that much in 14. Second time we see this mechanic, it becomes a case of hot potato instead of like stacking together and such, which the second part is definitely easier than the first one, but it took a little bit of getting used to, of course, the first time that we did see it. But I think the fire mechanic is really cool. The Exaflare mechanic, this is like whatever, how many times have we seen Exaflares at this point? They were pretty simple to figure out. It's literally just everybody needs to be spread at a wall, because we of course have those proximity AoEs going off as well, and then just dodge Exaflares. It's nothing new at this point. And then we had the towers. Towers themselves gave us a little bit of trouble, mostly because we had to get used to the rules of the mechanic, I guess you could say. Like, depending on what debuff you have, you're going to be going to a specific starting position, and once you know your starting position, the rest of the mechanic is pretty easy. But it took a little while to kind of like learn it, like where all of your starting positions are. There's no real logic for it, I guess you could say. It's literally just like, learn, if you have this debuff, you are going here, kind of thing. But once you learn that, the rest of the mechanic is actually fairly simple, because you just pay attention to what debuff you get, you know where you're going to be going, and then depending on what debuffs you get throughout the mechanic, you also know where you're going to be going. The end of the mechanic, however, I thought was really fun. I know that technically you can put both explosions on one half of the arena, and then the other half is the tank buster. But what most groups, I think, are doing is they just put both of the explosions on their respective side of the arena, and they rescue the player that is on the side where the tank buster is being taken. Which is really fun, because you don't really get to see rescue all that much in raids, especially not when it's like how you want to solve the mechanic. Like, usually you'd say, oh no, you're in the wrong position, let me yoink you over. This is more of a, we're gonna rescue you, this is the player that needs to be rescued during this mechanic, and that's how we want to resolve it. It was really fun to actually finally see that tool being used. Then of course we have the final UAV. This one is a little bit more difficult than the previous one, but again, it's just kind of like the similar mechanics that happened in the beginning, just different timings, some extra overlapping stuff going on as well. So it was definitely a lot more difficult, but it felt a pretty good ending to this fight. The Enrage itself is also really cool, like she embraces the ball or your world and she tries to crush it. Really well done in the end. So overall, I think this raid tier was really good. Every fight is good. The only small gripe that I have with this raid tier is that the first 2 minutes of our final encounter are kind of resident sleeper, but outside of that, I thought it was really good. So let's then talk about prog a little bit so that everybody's caught up, because I've talked about it on streams a couple times already, but I do know that not everybody watches my streams, of course. So when it came down to prog, we had some scheduling issues that we weren't aware of until we were already mid-prog. So when it came down to our scheduling, we always schedule the first couple of days up until Friday, and then while we do have the weekend and Monday available to us, we haven't put set times into it. Like, for example, if we're really close to the clear on Friday, we'll just be like, okay, let's take Saturday afternoon off, we'll just go in the evening or something like that. If we know we need more time, we'll take the afternoon as well, that kind of stuff. However, when we were raiding on Thursday, all of a sudden we found out that we wouldn't have time on Saturday, we would only have half a day on Sunday in the evening, and we wouldn't be able to raid on Monday either. And this kind of came out of nowhere, and nobody was made aware of this outside of our raid leader. So we were like, why was this not communicated? It's kind of shitty that people literally took time off from work or other IRL responsibilities. It was just kind of a shitty situation, you know? Like, of course, I understand that not everybody wants to do hardcore raiding, but if you join a group like this, then you're kind of like putting it out there that you do want to do this, you know? So that was kind of like a shitty situation. In the end, we did end up getting lucky because for the player that wouldn't be available on Saturday, his thing got rescheduled for the week after, so we were able to raid on Saturday. But Sunday afternoon and Monday the entire day we couldn't raid, and if we did have that extra time, then we would have definitely been able to clear on week 1. So it was a little bit unfortunate that we weren't able to get it because of these scheduling issues. But of course, real life is still real life, and we just made peace with it, and we decided to clear on a later date. Now, at the end of our last raiding session during week 1, both of our healers decided to leave the static. Now, there is no bad blood between us at all. It was just for personal reasons and, again, IRL responsibilities. One of our healers has had a horrendous working schedule when it comes down to scheduling around it, to like schedule raid days and that kind of stuff. It was especially difficult during our Omega Ultimate proc. Like sometimes we would literally only have 2 days that we would be able to raid during the week because of scheduling issues. So that's why he kind of decided to take a step down from the static, because it was not only annoying for us but for him as well. Like nobody wants to make it so that your friends are basically like not being able to do stuff because you have work and that kind of stuff. So that's why he decided to take a step down so that he wouldn't have to deal with all of that stress. Our raid leader also decided to step down. Like she had been raid leading us for I think 6 years at this point. I've been with the static for I think 4 or 5 at this point as well. But she's basically been raid leading it for a very long time. Again, with all the scheduling issues that we've had for the last couple of months, pretty stressful. She kind of just wanted to take a break from raiding in a static, which again, I totally understand because I'm someone that has thought about taking a break from raiding in a static for quite some time as well, but I don't think I'm going to be quitting just yet. So those 2 players basically took a step down from the static. Lily stayed with us for an extra week while we were still doing re-clears. But after that, she also decided to leave the group. When it came down to week 3, our melee also went on vacation to Japan for 2 weeks. So we had to find a replacement for that as well. Now, when it came down to it, we already knew about the vacation, of course. So I had a substitute lined up for him for week 3 and week 4. But because on week 2, we were already missing one of our healers, he came in a week early, which great that he was able to do that. But because we were doing kind of like a makeshift static thing on week 2, we decided to not proc P12 because one of our melees went tank, so that our tank could go healer, so that our substitute melee could join the group. So that's how we did 9 through 11 re-clears on week 2, but we decided we wouldn't really want to go into P12 like that. Week 3, we then got 2 healer friends of one of our people in the static that were joining us for 2 weeks, and then we ended up progging through P12 with them, ended up clearing it last weekend, and then yesterday we also did our re-clears with them, which was pretty good. When it comes down to going forward now, our melee is coming back next week, so our substitute melee is going to be leaving the static again, which by the way, Panda, if you're watching this, thanks a lot for joining us, we're a big help. He was one of my stream viewers that ended up watching the stream quite a bit, ended up offering to join us for 2 weeks, which we're very grateful that he did, because it's always really difficult to find a substitute just for 2 weeks, if they're not like on alts or something like that, because the 2 healers that are joining us, they're playing on their alts, but when it comes down to most people in this game, they just play one character, and usually they either already have a static or they raid in PF. So joining a static for 2 weeks only, just to sub in, especially this early into the raid tier, isn't something that happens all that often. It's quite difficult to find, so really grateful that Panda was able to join us for these 2 weeks. Rest of my static is really happy that he was able to be here as well. And I'm also really happy that we were able to get the clears together of P12. Going into the next couple of weeks, Velox is coming back, so we're gonna have to teach him the rest of the fight and also like the new strats that we have adapted. And then our substitute healers are staying with us for at least another week, maybe a little bit longer, because we of course have to go find some new permanent healer replacements as well. And I'm hoping that we are able to find a permanent replacement for our healers by the time that we go into Criterion, because that's coming out in a couple of weeks. Really excited for that, and I definitely would like to do it with a full group and not with some substitutes as well. But yeah, that's kind of it. So P10 Savage, really good. When it came down to our prog, we had some scheduling issues. We're rebuilding our group right now. The people that left, there's no bad blood between us. Like, we still message on Discord sometimes. Like, it's all good. It's just real life happened. We're all getting older at this point. We all have real life responsibilities. And sometimes those responsibilities don't mix well together with raiding in a fixed group. So that's kind of what ended up happening for Savage. I hope it all kind of like clears things up as well for those that were wondering why all of a sudden there's new players in our group. That's kind of what ended up happening, and also what the plans are going towards the future. Damn, this video ended up being way longer than I thought it was going to be. But if you're still here, then thank you very much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you thought of our raid here. How have things been going for you? You finished it already? Are you progging it in PF? Where are you stuck on? Let me know how you are doing. And yeah, with that, I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.